I spend a lot of time thinking about cosmic catastrophes, the kinds of events that sound like science fiction but are actually locked into the physics of our universe. And there's one particular scenario that keeps me up at night, not because I'm afraid of it, but because so few people understand how close we actually are to experiencing it. We're talking about something that could fundamentally reshape human civilization in a matter of hours. Not days, not weeks, hours. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't wild speculation. This is science. This is physics. This is history. And if you understand what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand why I believe this is one of the most important conversations we need to be having right now. What we're discussing today is a threat that has the potential to unwind everything we've built. Could collapse our electrical grids. Could destroy our communication networks. Could interrupt our supply chains. Could cause deaths in the millions. And the worst part? We know it's coming. It's not a question of if. It's a question of when. And we're woefully unprepared for it. Let me set the stage for you, and I want you to picture this in your mind. I want you to visualize what I'm about to describe, because that's how you'll really understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. This isn't abstract. This is real. This is history, and it could happen again at any moment. The Carrington Event of 1859, when the sun attacked Earth. On September 1st, 1859, a British astronomer named Richard Carrington was conducting his morning solar observations. He was doing what he did almost every clear day, tracking sunspots through his telescope. You see, the sun isn't the calm, stable ball of plasma we used to think it was. It's actually a roiling, turbulent sphere of magnetic chaos, constantly shifting and changing. It's a furnace of thermonuclear reactions happening at densities and temperatures that are almost incomprehensible to the human mind. 864,000 miles in diameter, 109 times the diameter of Earth. So massive that 1 million Earths could fit inside it. And it's not static. It's dynamic. It's violent. It's alive with activity. Every second, the sun converts 600 million tons of hydrogen into helium through nuclear fusion. Every single second. The energy released is staggering. But not all of that energy comes out smoothly. The sun's interior is turbulent. Massive convection cells circulate plasma throughout the sun's body. Magnetic fields wind around like invisible ropes, forming loops and tangles. Sometimes those magnetic fields build up tension. They twist. They compress. The pressure increases. And when the tension becomes too great, when the magnetic field can no longer contain the plasma, they snap. The result is a solar flare, a sudden, violent release of energy. And sometimes, associated with that flare is a coronal mass ejection, a CME, where a massive bubble of plasma is hurled into space at incredible speeds. On that particular morning in September 1859, Carrington witnessed something extraordinary. He saw two brilliant bright spots appear on the sun's surface, so bright they cut through the glare of the sun itself. He watched them develop and move across the solar disk. Now, remember, Carrington was looking at the sun through a telescope in the middle of the day. The sun is incredibly bright, so bright that looking at it directly would instantly blind you. For something to be bright enough to be visible through that glare, through the overwhelming brightness of the sun itself, it has to be extraordinarily bright. What Carrington was witnessing was a coronal mass ejection, one of the largest solar eruptions ever recorded in human history. A coronal mass ejection is a violent explosion of plasma and magnetic field from the sun's corona. The corona is the sun's outer atmosphere, the part you see during a total solar eclipse as that beautiful halo of light surrounding the sun's dark disk. It's what gives solar eclipses their otherworldly beauty. The corona is normally cooler than you would expect. Counterintuitively, it's actually cooler than the sun's surface, which is one of the great mysteries of solar physics that scientists are still working to understand. But during a coronal mass ejection, the corona violently expels 1 billion tons of plasma, sometimes more, hurling it into space at speeds that can reach 2,000 kilometers per second. That's 4.5 million miles per hour. To put that in perspective, that's faster than the Apollo missions traveled to the moon. That's faster than any human-made object has ever traveled. We're talking about material moving at roughly 1% the speed of light. On September 1st, 1859, just before noon, the largest coronal mass ejection in recorded history erupted from the sun. The plasma shot out in all directions in a massive wave. The magnetic field was tangled and chaotic, twisted up like a rope that's been wound too tightly. And by sheer chance, a significant portion of that ejected plasma was headed directly at Earth. But here's the thing. Carrington didn't understand what he was seeing. He had no idea that the material he was observing, hurling through space at these incredible speeds, was about to slam into Earth's magnetosphere. He certainly didn't know what the consequences would be. How could he? The technology to measure and understand this hadn't been invented yet. He could only observe the bright spots on the sun and catalog what he saw. He noted the time. He drew pictures of what he observed. He recorded it in the annals of astronomy. But he couldn't possibly have known the significance of what he was witnessing. About 18 hours later, and I want you to think about that timeline because it matters, the solar wind reached Earth. This wasn't just any solar wind. A normal solar wind from the sun is a constant stream of charged particles flowing outward from the sun at speeds of about 400 kilometers per second. It's essentially the sun breathing out into space. It's a gentle, steady wind of charged particles. It's part of the normal background of the solar system. Every moment of every day, the sun is sending out this wind of particles. We're bathed in it. Our magnetosphere protects us from it. But what hit Earth on the morning of September 2nd, 1859, was not normal solar wind. This was a plasma tsunami. This was a shock wave carrying with it a massive cloud of plasma and an embedded magnetic field so powerful it would compress and distort Earth's magnetosphere. This was the sun, in a sense, clenching its fist and punching Earth. When that plasma bubble hit Earth's magnetosphere, it compressed it violently. The magnetosphere, the magnetic field generated by Earth's molten iron core, was being compressed like someone squeezing a balloon. The magnetic field lines were pushed inward. The entire structure of Earth's protective shield was being crushed. The effects were visible immediately. The auroras that night weren't confined to the polar regions where you normally see them. They were visible in Cuba. They were visible in Hawaii. They were visible in parts of South America. They were visible in places where auroras had never been recorded before. The night sky was so bright that people in the northern hemisphere reported being able to read newspapers outdoors at midnight. Imagine that for a moment. It's midnight. It should be completely dark outside. But the sky is so bright from aurora that you can clearly read text on a newspaper page. This wasn't twilight. This was the middle of the night, and the sky was bright. Children woke up in the middle of the night thinking it was morning. Livestock became confused and disoriented. The night sky was lit up with colors, greens, reds, purples, that seemed almost otherworldly to people who'd never seen anything like it. Reports came in from around the world of people being confused by the brightness. Farmers thought the sun was rising. People woke up thinking dawn had come in the middle of the night. But the most consequential part of the Carrington Event happened in systems that, at the time, were the most advanced technology humanity had developed. The telegraph systems that crisscrossed the continents. Telegraph operators reported being shocked by their equipment. Some described sparks flying from the machines. The paper in some machines actually caught fire from the heat of the sparks. Many telegraph networks simply went offline, unable to function. Some operators were actually injured by electric shocks from the equipment. Here's something extraordinary. The telegraph operators would disconnect the batteries powering their equipment, trying to protect the systems, and the machines would continue to function anyway, powered entirely by the induced currents flowing through the wires from Earth's geomagnetic disturbance. Imagine that. Imagine equipment continuing to operate on its own, powered by the disturbance in Earth's magnetic field. The operators realized they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. They were witnessing the power of the Earth's magnetic field directly being induced into their electrical equipment. Now, at the time, this was an inconvenience. The telegraph was the internet of the 1850s. It was how information moved across long distances. But it was one of the only technologies affected by the geomagnetic storm. Telegraph operators could wait it out. They could disconnect their equipment. They could prevent damage by turning off their systems. Nobody's life was fundamentally dependent on the continuous operation of these machines in the way we depend on our technological infrastructure today. If the telegraph went down for a day, well, messages would be delayed. But people wouldn't starve. People wouldn't die from lack of medical care. The social order wouldn't collapse. People didn't depend on the telegraph for their food, their water, their electricity, their communication with loved ones in life or death situations. But let me ask you something. What would happen if the exact same event occurred today? What would happen today? The cascade of failure. Think about it. Right now, in 2026, every single thing that makes modern civilization possible runs on electricity. Not just runs on electricity, depends on it utterly and completely for continued existence. Your hospital runs on electricity. Your power grid runs on electricity. Your water treatment facilities run on electricity. Your food distribution networks run on electricity. Your financial systems run on electricity. Your communication networks run on electricity. The lights in your home run on electricity. The refrigerator that keeps your food from spoiling runs on electricity. The pump that brings water to your tap runs on electricity. The system that treats your sewage runs on electricity. The traffic lights that coordinate your transportation run on electricity. Your internet runs on electricity. Your cell phone, even when plugged in for charging, needs electricity. All of it. Everything. Every single system that keeps you alive. And not only does it depend on electricity, it depends on extremely complex, interconnected systems that have virtually no redundancy built into them. The entire structure is optimized for a very narrow range of operating conditions. When you compress the global economy down to its essentials, what you're left with is something rather shocking. A house of cards built on top of vulnerable infrastructure that has been optimized for efficiency, not resilience. And those two things are fundamentally at odds with each other. You can have efficiency or you can have redundancy, but you can't have both at maximum levels. The business world has chosen efficiency. Every dollar spent on backup systems is a dollar that doesn't go to the bottom line. Every percentage point of efficiency you sacrifice for resilience is a reduction in profit margins. So the incentives all point toward optimization for efficiency and away from resilience. Now, let me take you through what would actually happen if a Carrington-level event struck Earth in our modern era. And I want to be clear about something. I'm not speculating wildly here. I'm not writing science fiction. I'm taking scientific consensus, engineering reports from real institutions, and the actual documented impacts of smaller geomagnetic storms we've experienced in the modern era, and extrapolating forward to what the consequences would be. This isn't guesswork. This is what the physics tells us would happen. The sequence of events, minute by minute, hour by hour, it starts with a coronal mass ejection. The sun ejects a massive bubble of plasma and magnetic field into space. It's traveling at speeds between 1,500 and 2,500 kilometers per second. From the sun to Earth is about 150 million kilometers. At those speeds, the journey takes between 12 and 18 hours. There would be some warning. Solar observatories would detect the eruption within minutes of it happening. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center would issue alerts. News organizations might pick up the story. Social media would explode with people talking about it. Scientists would be discussing it. But here's the critical part. There's nothing you can do with that warning. You can't dodge a coronal mass ejection. It's headed directly at Earth or it's not. If it is headed at Earth, it's coming. You can't stop it. You can't deflect it. You can't negotiate with it. It's the laws of physics, and it would arrive in less than a day. When that plasma bubble hits Earth's magnetosphere, it would compress it violently. The magnetosphere is Earth's magnetic shield, the field generated by our liquid iron core that protects us from the solar wind. It's invisible, but it's real, and it's powerful. When a sufficiently large CME compresses it, it creates what's called a geomagnetic storm, a rapid disturbance of the magnetosphere that can last anywhere from a few hours to several days. The entire structure oscillates. The field lines twist. The plasma moves. Everything is in turmoil. During a major geomagnetic storm, something extraordinary happens. The rapid movement and distortion of Earth's magnetic field induces electrical currents in any long conductor on the planet. Think about what that means. Power lines stretching across states, railway tracks, telephone lines, the metal structures in buildings and skyscrapers, metal pipelines. All of these become electrical conductors with induced currents flowing through them. The Earth itself becomes part of a giant electrical circuit. But there's one particular set of conductors that matters more than all the others: the transformers in our electrical grid. And this is where things get really important, so I want to explain transformers in detail, because understanding how transformers work is essential to understanding why a geomagnetic storm would be so catastrophic. This is the key. This is what determines whether civilization survives or collapses. How transformers work and why they're vulnerable. A transformer is a relatively simple device. Conceptually, you have a core made of laminated steel, thin sheets of steel stacked together. Around this core, you have two coils of wire, one wrapped around the other. This is called the primary coil and the secondary coil. When you push alternating current through the primary coil, it creates a changing magnetic field in the steel core. This changing magnetic field induces a voltage in the secondary coil. By adjusting the ratio of the number of turns in each coil, you can step voltage up or step voltage down. This is elegant. This is how we transmit electricity efficiently over long distances. You generate electricity at 25,000 volts. You step it up to 765,000 volts using a transformer. At that voltage, the current is small, and therefore the losses in the transmission line are minimal. You transmit it thousands of miles. Then you step it down to lower voltages for distribution. Then you step it down again for use in homes. The entire electrical grid is built around networks of transformers. At power plants, you have massive transformers that step the voltage up for transmission. These are enormous devices that can weigh 300 tons or more. In transmission substations along the way, you have more transformers. As the electricity approaches cities and towns, you have transformers that step the voltage down for distribution. In neighborhoods, smaller transformers on poles convert that down to the voltage that comes into your home, 120 to 240 volts. So whether you realize it or not, you're constantly using transformers. Your entire electrical life depends on transformers functioning correctly. But here's the critical detail that makes transformers vulnerable to geomagnetic storms. Transformers have a saturation point. The steel core can only store a limited amount of magnetic energy. If you push too much current through the primary coil, the magnetic field becomes too strong. The steel becomes magnetically saturated. Once saturated, increasing the current further doesn't increase the magnetic field strength. The material has reached its limit. Can't be magnetized any further. Once saturated, something bad happens. The transformer essentially stops functioning as a transformer. It becomes something else entirely. When a transformer saturates, several catastrophic things happen. First, the voltage regulation fails. You can no longer rely on the ratio of voltages between primary and secondary coils. The relationship breaks down. The voltage on the secondary side becomes unpredictable and unstable. You have high voltage where you expected low voltage. This causes damage to everything connected to that transformer. Second, the transformer draws enormous amounts of current from the power source. This current is called magnetizing current. It's not actually doing any useful work, it's not powering any loads, but it flows through the transformer and through the power lines feeding the transformer anyway. The current can be many times the normal operating current. This massive current creates massive heating in the power lines. Third, the transformer starts to overheat. This is because of resistive heating from the excess current. The insulation starts to break down. The oil that cools the transformer, large transformers are typically cooled with mineral oil, starts to degrade. The oil's insulating properties degrade. Gases form. The temperature climbs. Eventually, if the saturation continues long enough, the transformer fails catastrophically. The insulation breaks down completely. Arcs form inside the transformer. The transformer essentially catches fire from the inside. The transformer becomes useless. It's destroyed. And the replacement, as we'll see, could take months or years to obtain. During a geomagnetic storm, what happens is that the rapidly changing magnetic field from the storm induces a low-frequency electrical current in the power lines. This is different from the normal alternating current that the grid carries, which oscillates at 60 Hz in North America and 50 Hz in Europe. 60 Hz means the current oscillates 60 times per second. That's 60 complete cycles of positive and negative current every second. The power system is designed around this frequency. Everything is tuned to this frequency. The current induced by a geomagnetic storm oscillates much more slowly, maybe once every several seconds or even once every minute. Sometimes it's even slower, quasi-DC, or direct current-like behavior. This slow oscillation is the problem because the protection systems aren't designed for it. This slow oscillating current flows through the power lines and through the transformers. And this is where the vulnerability lies. The transformers in the grid are designed to handle the normal operating currents, which are at 60 Hz or 50 Hz. The protective equipment, the relays and circuit breakers that are designed to detect faults and disconnect equipment to protect it, are all tuned to respond to faults at these frequencies. They're looking for overcurrents at 60 Hz. The relay settings are calibrated for 60 Hz operation. But the slow oscillating current from the geomagnetic storm is not 60 Hz. It's much lower frequency. The slow oscillating current can build up to very large values without triggering the protection systems that are designed to protect against 60 Hz overcurrents. By the time the protection systems realize there's a problem, the transformers are already saturating. And once saturated, the protective relays might not even be able to function properly because the voltage being supplied to them is distorted. The relays might not be able to make the correct decisions. So you end up in a situation where the transformers are saturating without protection systems being able to interrupt the current. The transformers overheat and fail. And once enough transformers have failed, the grid loses capacity. Load exceeds the capacity of the remaining transformers and lines. More protective devices trip offline. The cascade continues until large portions of the grid have gone offline. Historical precedents. What we've learned from smaller events. This is not hypothetical. This is not speculation. This has actually happened. This is what happened during smaller geomagnetic storms. In 1989, during a moderate geomagnetic storm, nothing like Carrington, but still significant, the Hydro-Quebec power system in Canada experienced a cascade failure that resulted in a blackout affecting millions of people. The blackout lasted 9 hours. It was caused by exactly this phenomenon, saturation of transformers leading to instability in the power system and cascade failures of protection devices. Let me paint the picture of what happened in Quebec in 1989. It was March 13th. A geomagnetic storm was hitting Earth. The induced currents started flowing through the power lines. At the Manicouagan substation in the north of Quebec, the transformers began to saturate. The reactive power demands increased dramatically. The voltage dropped. The voltage drop triggered more protection devices to trip. One by one, transmission lines tripped offline. It happened very quickly, in just a few seconds. The entire Quebec grid was isolated from the rest of North America. The system lost synchronization. The frequency started to deviate. More protection devices tripped. The whole system collapsed. And suddenly, 9 million people in Quebec didn't have electricity. Hospitals switched to backup generators. Traffic lights went out. The stock exchange halted trading. But after 9 hours, power was restored. Utility crews worked around the clock. The grid came back online. Life went on. But think about this. The 1989 event was a moderate geomagnetic storm. It affected one power company in one region. It was a localized catastrophe, geographically speaking. Now imagine if the same magnitude of geomagnetic disturbance hit the entire continent simultaneously. Imagine if not just Quebec, but every power company on the grid, from the west coast to the east coast, from Canada to Mexico, was dealing with transformer saturation at the same time. There would be no one to call for help. There would be no unaffected regions to draw power from. The cascade would spread across the entire interconnected grid. The entire system would collapse. Imagine that. A cascade failure spreading across the entire continent in seconds. And that's what would happen in a Carrington-level event. That's what we're talking about. The National Academies of Sciences conducted a comprehensive study on this exact scenario. They modeled what would happen if a Carrington-level geomagnetic storm struck the United States today. They calculated that if a Carrington-level event struck the United States, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the large power transformers in the grid would be permanently damaged or destroyed in the initial event. That might sound like a small percentage, but remember, these transformers carry the majority of the nation's electrical power. Losing 5 to 10% of them would result in cascading blackouts affecting tens of millions of people. In a nationwide scenario, you could be looking at blackouts affecting 100 million people or more, not for a few hours, for weeks, for months, in some cases possibly longer. Extended, sustained blackouts affecting the entire nation or large portions of it. Not a minor inconvenience. A complete collapse of the electrical infrastructure over huge regions. The national academies also calculated the economic impact. They estimated that if a Carrington-level geomagnetic storm struck today, the economic impact would be between $2 and $5 trillion, just in direct economic losses. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the entire gross domestic product of the United Kingdom. That's larger than the entire GDP of France. That's larger than the GDP of India. We're talking about economic losses larger than the GDP of any nation except the United States and China. And that's just the direct economic impact. It doesn't account for the indirect effects. It doesn't account for the deaths. It doesn't account for the suffering. It doesn't account for the long-term disruption to society. The bottleneck, transformer replacement, and the recovery timeline. But here's where the scenario becomes truly catastrophic. You don't just need to replace the damaged transformers. You need to do it while the rest of your electrical infrastructure has partially failed. You're trying to conduct large-scale replacements with compromised logistics networks. You're trying to source rare materials and components in a global supply chain that's partially broken. And in the meantime, demand exceeds supply in chaotic and unpredictable ways. The national academies estimated the recovery timeline. They estimated that the full recovery from a Carrington-level event, getting the entire grid back to normal, would take between 4 and 10 years. 4 to 10 years. Let that sink in. 4 to 10 years of not having electricity in many parts of the country. 4 to 10 years of a partially functioning grid at best. 4 to 10 years of dealing with the consequences. Not just dealing with the immediate aftermath, but years and years of recovery. But here's the problem. The recovery timeline for the electrical grid is actually determined by the timeline for manufacturing and installing replacement transformers. And that's where the bottleneck is. The largest transformers are the hardest to replace. These are massive devices, sometimes weighing 300 tons or more. Many of them are custom-built for specific substations. The manufacturing pipeline for replacement transformers is measured in months, not days or weeks. A single transformer can take 6 months to a year to manufacture. And that's under normal circumstances, when there's not a global emergency. Let me give you some specific numbers. There are about 2,000 to 3,000 large power transformers in the United States. These are the transformers that carry the bulk of the nation's electrical power. The global manufacturing capacity for large power transformers is somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 units per year. That sounds like enough. But in a Carrington event scenario, you might need to replace 100 to 300 of these transformers simultaneously in the United States alone. And that's just in the United States. If the event is global, and it would be, you're looking at replacing thousands of transformers worldwide. The entire world's transformer manufacturing capacity would be mobilized for recovery. You're looking at a situation where demand massively exceeds supply. The world's transformer manufacturing capacity would be overwhelmed for years. Moreover, if a Carrington event occurs, the manufacturing facilities themselves might be affected. If the power grid in a transformer manufacturing facility goes down, the facility can't operate. Machines that are used to manufacture transformers require electricity. The facility might be down for weeks or months. When it comes back online, it's going to be part of the global recovery effort. It's going to be trying to manufacture transformers for recovery. But it's also going to be dealing with its own recovery from the blackout. Supply chain disruptions, worker shortages, transportation challenges, damage to equipment, So you're looking at a situation where the recovery is severely hampered by the shortage of the very equipment needed to enable the recovery. It's a catch-22. It's a circular problem. You can't restore power without replacing transformers. But you can't manufacture transformers without power. Immediate cascading consequences. The first hours and days. Let me walk you through what those immediate consequences would look like, because the electrical grid is just one piece of the puzzle. It's a critical piece, but it's not the only piece. The collapse of the electrical grid triggers cascading failures in every other critical system. Each failure triggers more failures. It's a cascade of collapse. The moment the power grid fails, and we're talking about a massive, multi-state or even nationwide failure in the worst case, water treatment facilities stop working. The pumps that push water through the pipes into your home require electricity. Lots of electricity. A modern city requires massive amounts of power to push water to the upper floors of tall buildings. The water has to be pumped from the source, through treatment plants, through main distribution lines, through smaller distribution lines, up through pipes into your home. All of that requires electrical pumps. All of it. Within hours, the water coming out of your tap stops. Not gradually, it stops abruptly. The pressure drops. The water stops flowing. One moment you have water. The next moment you don't. The same goes for wastewater treatment. The systems that pump sewage out of homes and treat it require electricity. Without electricity, those systems can't function. The sewage backs up. Everything that relies on the infrastructure processing and disposing of human waste begins backing up. Raw sewage accumulates. Disease becomes an immediate concern. We're talking about the sewage system backing up in a city. We're talking about raw sewage accumulating in sewers and eventually backing up into homes. We're talking about water sources being contaminated with human waste. We're talking about conditions more like the 19th century than the 21st century. Disease becomes a major concern within days, and it becomes critical within weeks. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, diseases we've eliminated from developed nations become common again. Hospitals, which have backup generators, can operate those generators for a limited time. But those generators require fuel. The fuel delivery system, the pumps at gas stations that dispense fuel, the trucks that distribute fuel, all of that runs on electricity. Within days, maybe a week, hospitals would exhaust their fuel reserves. You would have a situation where people requiring dialysis or chemotherapy or intensive care would suddenly find that the infrastructure supporting their treatment no longer exists. A hospital's backup generator might have enough fuel for a few days. But a city would have days' worth of fuel in its distribution system. Beyond that, there's no fuel. No new fuel is coming because the system that distributes fuel has broken down. Gas stations can't pump gas without electricity. The fuel trucks can't be filled without working pumps. Food. Here's something most people don't think about. Modern food distribution is just in time. Grocery stores don't stockpile months of food. They receive deliveries constantly. Those deliveries are coordinated through complex computer networks that require electricity and telecommunications. Without that coordination, the distribution system collapses. Trucks that were scheduled to deliver food to stores never arrive because the roads are congested and they run out of fuel. Refrigerated trucks that are supposed to keep food cold lose power and the food spoils. Within 3 days to a week, grocery stores would be emptied of perishable food. Within 2 weeks, they'd be stripped of non-perishable food. Canned goods would disappear. Bread would disappear. Everything edible would be consumed or looted. People would begin going hungry. And here's the thing. In an urban area, most people don't have the knowledge or resources to feed themselves independently. You've got a modern city with millions of people who are completely dependent on the supply system for food. They can't grow food. They don't know how to hunt or fish. They have no way to feed themselves if the supply system breaks. Most city dwellers have maybe a week's worth of food in their homes. After that, they depend on resupply. You've got a modern city with millions of people who suddenly can't access food beyond what they've got in their pantries. And after that week, there's nothing. They're hungry. Communication. The cellular networks that we all depend on don't just require electricity. They require sophisticated telecommunications infrastructure that depends on electricity and the internet backbone. When the grid fails, cellular networks go offline. Cell towers have backup batteries, but those batteries last a few hours at best. After that, the towers depend on backup generators. But generators need fuel, and fuel supply depends on the transportation system, which depends on electricity. Within 24 hours, the vast majority of cell service is offline. The internet goes offline. The backbone infrastructure that carries data across long distances requires power. The data centers that host websites and cloud services require power. Landline phone service is also affected. The phone network depends on electricity. The switches that route calls require power. Without power, the phone network stops working. You're cut off from being able to call for help. You're cut off from being able to access information about what's happening. You're cut off from being able to coordinate responses. There's a kind of second-order catastrophe here. As society tries to respond to the initial crisis, the inability to communicate exacerbates the problem exponentially. Emergency services try to coordinate response, but they can't communicate across jurisdictions. Hospitals try to access patient records from other hospitals, but they can't access the internet. Businesses try to conduct transactions, but they can't access their financial systems or their suppliers. Authorities try to implement emergency measures, but they can't communicate the orders to the people who need to carry them out. Information doesn't flow. Coordination fails. Everyone is isolated. Finance. The global financial system is built on digital infrastructure. Every transaction, every record, every piece of financial information exists on computer systems. In a nationwide blackout, you can't withdraw money. You can't transfer funds. Credit cards don't work because the systems that verify them don't work. ATM machines don't work because they require power and network connectivity. In the immediate aftermath of a Carrington-level event, you would effectively have the collapse of the financial system as a secondary effect of the electrical grid failure. People with money in banks couldn't access it. Money in investment accounts becomes inaccessible. Loans can't be serviced. The entire economic system would seize up. The stock market wouldn't open. Trading would stop. The global financial system would essentially cease to function. All economic activity that depends on digital transactions would stop. Transportation. Without electricity, traffic lights don't work. Fuel pumps at gas stations don't work. The computers that control modern vehicles don't work on the ones that depend on them for engine management. Modern cars have computer control systems that manage fuel injection, ignition timing, and transmission shifting. Without electricity, many modern cars simply won't start. The computer won't function. The fuel injectors won't work. Aircraft are grounded because aviation infrastructure depends entirely on electrical systems. The navigation systems, the communication systems, the radar systems that control air traffic, all offline. Trains can't operate because trains depend on electricity for propulsion or for signaling systems. Shipping stops because ships can't navigate safely without GPS and communication systems. The supply chains that keep the entire civilization running just stop. Every system that moves goods and people stops. The detailed timeline, hour-by-hour breakdown of the catastrophe. Let me give you a more detailed timeline of how this unfolds, because understanding the timeline helps you understand why the situation becomes so dire so quickly. Hour 0 to 6. Initial impact: the coronal mass ejection hits Earth's magnetosphere. The geomagnetic storm begins. The induced currents start flowing through power lines. Within seconds, transformers begin to saturate. Within minutes, the first major power outages occur. Hospitals switch to backup generators. Data centers switch to battery backup. Emergency broadcast systems try to activate. The first 911 calls flood in. Traffic lights go out in major cities. Accidents begin to occur at intersections. People are confused about what's happening. Hour 6 to 12. System failure within 6 hours. It becomes clear that this is not a localized outage. The entire electrical grid is compromised. Large regions are without power. Water pressure is dropping. Traffic is becoming chaotic. Grocery stores are still open, but they're starting to see surges of people trying to buy supplies while power is still on. Gas stations are running out of fuel because the pumps are powered by electricity and are shutting down. People begin to panic. The government tries to respond, but communication is difficult. Cell networks are failing. The internet is becoming unreliable. Hour 12 to 24, first full day by 24 hours, the situation is becoming dire. Hospitals have begun discharging non-critical patients to conserve fuel for generators. Pharmacies are closed, and people dependent on medications are panicking. Fuel stations are closed because their pumps require electricity. Traffic on roads is increasingly chaotic as traffic lights remain offline. Grocery stores remain open but with limited supplies and without refrigeration for perishable goods. People are beginning to hoard supplies. Water pressure has dropped significantly. Many homes don't have water at all. Day 2 to 3. Social breakdown begins by the second or third day. The first signs of serious social breakdown are beginning to appear. In some areas, people are looting stores for supplies and fuel. Water systems are beginning to fail in some urban areas, creating sanitation issues. Police and emergency services are overwhelmed by emergency calls. The sheer volume of incidents exceeds their capacity to respond. Communications between different response agencies are failing because they're using local cellular networks that are no longer reliable. Day 3 to 7. Deterioration accelerates by day 3. The situation has deteriorated significantly. Food in refrigerators and freezers has spoiled. Supplies in grocery stores have been consumed or looted. Fuel is becoming scarce because there's no way to distribute it through the normal channels. Water systems have failed in multiple major cities. The incidence of illness is beginning to spike as sanitation systems break down. Medical emergencies that would normally be handled by hospitals are going untreated. The emergency medical system is completely overwhelmed. Fires break out and can't be controlled because water pressure is insufficient to fight them and emergency responders are overwhelmed. Week 1 to 2. Deaths begin by 1 week. The death toll is beginning to climb. Deaths from lack of medication for chronic conditions, medical emergencies that can't be treated, accidents caused by lack of traffic control, and disease are occurring daily. Elderly people on dialysis begin dying as dialysis centers lose power and fuel. Diabetics begin dying as insulin spoils without refrigeration. People with infections begin dying as antibiotics become unavailable. The economic consequences are becoming apparent. Businesses can't operate. Without power, supply chains have broken down. The financial system has seized up because the digital infrastructure supporting it is offline. People can't access their bank accounts. ATMs don't work. The unemployment rate in the affected region is essentially 100%. There's simply no way to conduct business. Week 2 to 4. Societal collapse by 2 weeks. The affected region has become effectively lawless in many areas. Police and military forces are trying to maintain order, but they're overwhelmed. Looting is widespread. Violence is escalating. People are desperate for food and water. The government is trying to establish emergency services and distribute food and water, but the scale of the crisis exceeds their capacity. Conflicts break out over resources. Month 1 to 3. The long emergency over the following months. The situation slowly improves as temporary solutions are implemented and power begins to be restored in stages. But the recovery is measured in months for partial restoration, not complete restoration. The recovery timeline is determined by the availability of replacement transformers, which are manufactured slowly. Year 1 to 10. The long recovery over the next years, the society slowly returns to normal. But the full recovery could take a decade or more. Why we know this is real and happening. Now, I want to be very precise about what we know and don't know here. We know that geomagnetic storms of the magnitude required to cause this kind of damage have happened before. The Carrington Event in 1859 is the most famous example, but it's not the only one. In 1921, there was another major geomagnetic storm. It was called the Magnetic Storm of May 1921. It was smaller than the Carrington Event, but it was still a major event. It caused significant damage to electrical infrastructure of the era. Telephone and telegraph systems went offline. Long-distance telephone service was disrupted. It would have caused even more damage if the grid had been more extensive and more interconnected. In 1989, as I mentioned, there was a major geomagnetic storm that caused the Quebec blackout. In 2003, there was another significant event that affected power systems. In 2012, a major geomagnetic storm narrowly missed hitting Earth. If it had hit just a week earlier, it would have been catastrophic. It missed by about a week. In March 2021, a geomagnetic storm caused damage to power systems in South Africa. In December 2021, another geomagnetic storm affected power systems in Turkey and India. We had alerts about solar storms in 2023 and 2024. These events keep happening. So this is not something that happened once hundreds of years ago. This is something that happens repeatedly. It's something that's happened multiple times in the modern era. And we know, because we can study the sun and we can look at records of solar activity, that it will happen again. What we also know is that these events are not rare on a geological timescale. The Carrington Event was the largest recorded geomagnetic storm. But scientists have found evidence in geological records of even larger events. Ice cores contain records of past solar particle events recorded as isotope ratios. Tree rings show evidence of past geomagnetic disturbances. And they've studied solar activity patterns and estimated how frequently these events occur. The estimates suggest that Carrington-level events occur approximately once every 100 to 200 years. Probability and why the timeline matters. Now, you might hear that statistic and think, well, we got lucky. The last one was in 1859, so we probably won't see another one for another 100 years. But that's not how probability works. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of statistics. The fact that a Carrington-level event happened in 1859 doesn't reset the clock. It doesn't make another one less likely to happen in the near future. It's like rolling a die. Just because you rolled a 6 doesn't mean you're less likely to roll another 6 on the next roll. Each roll is independent. The probability of rolling a 6 on any single roll is 1 in 6, regardless of what you rolled before. Actually, let me be more precise about this because the statistics are fascinating and important. If we're talking about a roughly 1 in 150-year event on average, that means in any given year, there's about a 1 in 150 chance of it happening. Now, what's the probability that it will happen within the next 10 years? You can calculate this using the formula for cumulative probability. The probability of not getting a Carrington event in the next 10 years is 149/150 to the 10th power. That equals about 0.935 or 93.5%. So the probability of not getting the event is 93.5%, which means the probability of getting the event is 100% minus 93.5%, which is 6.5%. But that's based on a simple 150-year recurrence interval. Some studies suggest it could be every 100 years. If we use 100 years as the average, the calculation changes. Using 100 years as the average recurrence interval, the probability in the next 10 years is about 9.5%. Over the next 20 years, it's about 18%. Over the next 50 years, it's about 39%. Over the next 100 years, if we use 100 as the average recurrence interval, the probability is much higher. The probability of not getting a Carrington event in 100 years is 99/100 to the 100th power. That's approximately 0.366, or about 37%. So the probability of getting a Carrington-level event within the next 100 years is approximately 63%. That's better than a coin flip. There's a better than even chance that a Carrington-level event will occur within the next 100 years. That's not negligible. That's not something we can dismiss. That's higher than the probability of many things we spend enormous resources trying to prevent. We spend billions of dollars trying to prevent asteroid impacts, and the probability of an extinction-level asteroid impact in any given year is far lower than the probability of a Carrington-level geomagnetic storm. We spend billions on pandemic preparedness, and the probability of a pandemic this year that's as severe as COVID-19 is lower than the probability of a Carrington event this year. And yet, we've done very little to prepare for the Carrington event threat. That's what gets under my skin. That's what keeps me up at night. The threat is real. The probability is significant. The consequences would be catastrophic. And yet we've done almost nothing about it. The paradox of invisible threats and short-term incentives. And here's the thing that really gets under my skin. We've known about this threat for decades. Literally decades. Not years. Decades. The scientific community has understood the vulnerability since at least the 1970s. There have been countless reports, studies, and recommendations. In 1989, after the Quebec blackout, there was increased attention to the threat. Scientists said, "This is a problem. We need to address this." In 1995, the Department of Energy began a major study on the vulnerability of the grid to geomagnetic storms. In 2010, the American Physical Society released a detailed report about the risks to the electrical grid from geomagnetic storms. It was a comprehensive report. It laid out the problem in detail. In 2012, the National Academies released another comprehensive study warning about the consequences. The report was called Severe Space Weather Events: Understanding Societal and Economic Impacts. It was very detailed. It explored every aspect of the problem. In 2015, the National Science Board issued another warning. In 2016, there was the Secure and Resilient Energy and Infrastructure Act introduced in Congress. The American Society of Civil Engineers rated geomagnetic storms and space weather events as one of the top 10 risks to American infrastructure. They literally said, "This is one of the 10 biggest risks we face." The Department of Homeland Security has identified it as a critical national security threat. The Department of Energy has studied it extensively. The intelligence community has studied it. Everyone who studies critical infrastructure at a serious level understands that this is a threat. And yet, as of 2026, we still have not taken the necessary steps to properly harden our electrical grid against this threat. We know what to do. The solutions are well understood. But we haven't done it. Why? There are several reasons, and they're all rather human and rather depressing. First, there's the cost. Properly hardening the electrical grid against geomagnetic storms would cost billions of dollars. That's not an insignificant amount of money, even for a wealthy nation. And that's money that the utilities that own and operate the grid would have to spend, which comes out of their profits. The electrical industry has lobbied against major grid hardening initiatives, arguing that the cost is not justified by the probability of the event. From their perspective, why should they spend billions today to protect against something that might not happen for decades, if at all? The incentives are all wrong. There's no profit in prevention. There's only cost. Prevention doesn't generate revenue. It only reduces profit margins. Second, there's the tragedy of abstract risk. A Carrington-level event hasn't happened during anyone's lifetime. It's easy to discount the risk of something that hasn't happened recently. We're bad at assessing low-probability, high-impact risks. Our brains are wired to react to immediate, visceral threats, not to abstract future scenarios. If a solar storm hit us next week, the urgency would be obvious. Every news channel would be covering it. Politicians would be talking about emergency response. But in the abstract, it's easy to say, well, it probably won't happen while I'm in charge, so let's leave it for someone else to deal with. Third, there's the coordination problem. The electrical grid in the United States is operated by thousands of different utilities, some public, some private, some cooperatives, some municipal. There's no single entity responsible for the whole system. Making changes requires coordination across all of them. If one utility invests heavily in grid hardening and another doesn't, the one that invested spent money without getting the benefit of protection against a catastrophic event. The grid is interconnected, but if one company hardens its transformers and another doesn't, both are still vulnerable because the failure can cascade through both. That's a perverse incentive. This is a classic tragedy of the commons problem. Everyone would benefit from the whole system being hardened, but individually each actor has incentive to avoid bearing the cost. And fourth, there's the problem of technological optimism. There's a sense in the technology industry, and in American culture more broadly, that we'll solve this problem with technology before it becomes an issue. We'll develop better forecasting. We'll detect solar storms earlier. We'll develop better mitigation technology. We'll spread the risk across more diverse systems. We'll build redundancy into the critical systems. We'll develop new technologies that are immune to geomagnetic disruption. But here's the problem. All of that takes time and money, and both of those commodities are in short supply when there's no immediate crisis forcing the issue. Other existential threats to technological civilization. Now, I want to talk about something interesting that gets less attention than the geomagnetic storm threat. The question of whether our technological systems are getting more vulnerable to catastrophic failure in general, not just from space weather. When you look at the history of technological systems, there's a pattern. As systems become more sophisticated and more interconnected, they become more efficient, but they also become more fragile. This is called the brittleness paradox. A simple system with lots of redundancy is robust. If one part fails, the system continues to function. But that redundancy comes at a cost. A sophisticated system with minimal redundancy is efficient. Every part serves a critical function, and there's no waste. But it's also brittle. The failure of a single critical component can cascade through the entire system. Our modern electrical grid is a perfect example of this. It's incredibly efficient. Electricity is generated far from where it's consumed and transmitted across long distances. Power plants operate at maximum capacity most of the time. The system is optimized to minimize costs and maximize profits. But that optimization has come at the cost of resilience. There are backup systems, but they're often overwhelmed when they're needed most. Failures cascade through the system in unpredictable ways. Take the global supply chain, for instance. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the just-in-time supply chain seemed like a marvel of modern efficiency. Goods were manufactured in Asia, shipped to ports, transported to distribution centers, and delivered to stores within days. There was minimal inventory at each step, which minimized costs. But when the pandemic hit and factories shut down or operated at reduced capacity, the entire system seized up. Grocery stores ran out of toilet paper. Computer chips became scarce. The automotive industry ran out of parts. It took months to recover. And that was from a localized disruption. Factories were shut down, but the transportation and logistics networks still functioned. Imagine what would happen if a Carrington event suddenly shut down not just some factories, but all of the digital coordination systems that keep the supply chain functioning. Imagine that the systems that track goods, coordinate shipments, verify payments, and schedule deliveries were all offline. The supply chain wouldn't just slow down. It would stop completely. It would collapse. Solutions and what could be done. Now, here's where we should talk about what's being done to prevent this, and what could be done that isn't. The electrical industry has made some improvements in recent years. There have been upgrades to some substations to include surge protection. Some utilities have installed monitoring systems that can detect unusual currents that might indicate geomagnetic storm activity. There have been recommendations to upgrade transformer specifications to make them more resistant to extreme currents. And there are ongoing discussions in the regulatory environment about whether to mandate these kinds of upgrades. But here's the problem. These measures are piecemeal. They're not coordinated across the industry. They're not mandatory in most states. And they're not sufficient to address the full scale of the threat. A truly resilient system would require a comprehensive overhaul of the electrical grid infrastructure. First, you'd need to improve transformer specifications. Transformers can be designed to handle larger currents. You can use different materials. You can improve the insulation. You can design the transformer's cooling system to handle higher temperatures. These modifications would make the transformer more expensive and possibly slightly less efficient, but they would make it survivable to a geomagnetic storm. Second, there's the question of surge protection at the point where power lines connect to transformers. You can install devices that limit the voltage and current that reaches the transformer, similar to surge protectors that you might use for your home electronics. These can be deployed relatively quickly and at cost savings compared to replacing damaged transformers. Some utilities have begun installing these devices, but the deployment has not been comprehensive. Third, there's the question of distributed generation and energy storage. If instead of having all of the electricity generated at a few large power plants and transmitted long distances, you had more generation distributed throughout the system, solar panels on rooftops, wind turbines in neighborhoods, small-scale hydroelectric installations, and if you had energy storage systems at various points in the system, batteries, compressed air storage, Thermal storage. The system could function at reduced capacity even if major parts of the transmission system were offline. Fourth, there's the question of islanding, the ability to disconnect parts of the grid and have them continue to function independently. If a portion of the grid could isolate itself from the larger grid when a geomagnetic storm occurs, it could continue to operate even if other parts of the grid failed. This requires sophisticated control systems and would require coordination between utilities. But it's technically feasible and would significantly improve the resilience of the system. Fifth, there's the question of establishing strategic stockpiles of critical components. If you knew that large power transformers would be destroyed in a major geomagnetic event and that it would take months to replace them, you could establish a stockpile of replacement transformers positioned in strategic locations around the country. These transformers would be ready to deploy immediately after the event. This would reduce the recovery time significantly. The cost would be in the billions, but it would be worthwhile given the magnitude of the threat. All of these solutions are technically feasible. None of them require breakthrough technologies. They all exist today. The only barrier is cost and coordination. There are also some interesting solutions that are being researched. For instance, there's work being done on superconducting materials that could be used for transmission lines. Superconducting transmission lines would carry electricity with virtually no losses and would be immune to the kinds of induced currents that damage conventional lines. But superconducting transmission requires extremely cold temperatures, typically achieved through liquid nitrogen or liquid helium cooling. This makes superconducting transmission expensive. But as the technology improves and costs come down, it could potentially revolutionize the power grid. There's also work being done on advanced fault analysis and prediction systems. If you could detect the onset of a geomagnetic storm before it reached Earth and automatically disconnect vulnerable systems, you could prevent damage. This isn't really possible with our current level of warning. We get maybe 12 to 18 hours of warning for a CME. But in principle, with better solar monitoring and faster communications, you could disconnect systems that are vulnerable and reconnect them after the storm passes. The global dimension. Let me talk about the international dimension of this threat for a moment, because it's crucial and it's often overlooked. A Carrington-level geomagnetic storm doesn't respect national borders. If it hits the entire planet. Different parts of the planet might experience different levels of disruption depending on the orientation of the magnetic field in the CME, but the entire planet is affected. That means that a Carrington event would be a global catastrophe, affecting every nation simultaneously. This has profound implications. In the immediate aftermath, there would be no possibility of international aid coming from less affected regions to more affected regions, because the entire global system would be incapacitated. You couldn't fly aid planes because aviation infrastructure would be offline. You couldn't ship aid because maritime systems would be offline. You couldn't transfer money to purchase aid because the financial system would be offline. Each nation would have to fend for itself, dealing with the catastrophe using only the resources and infrastructure available within its own borders. And because different nations have different levels of infrastructure resilience and different capabilities to respond to crises, the impact on different nations would vary. Developing nations with less robust infrastructure would likely face much worse consequences than developed nations. They would have fewer backup systems. They would have less capacity to respond to emergencies. They might have weaker governments with less capacity to coordinate emergency response. The result could be that a Carrington event would cause far more deaths and suffering in developing nations than in developed nations. This has geopolitical implications. In the long term, if a Carrington event occurred and developing nations were devastated while developed nations managed to recover, it could alter the global balance of power. Migration from developing nations to developed nations could be enormous. There could be resource conflicts. The global order could be fundamentally reshuffled. The economics of prevention, and here's what I find most frustrating about this situation. The cost-benefit analysis of grid hardening is actually quite favorable, if you do the calculation correctly. A study by the National Academies estimated that a major geomagnetic storm would cost the global economy between $2 and $5 trillion. The cost of substantially hardening the power grid against geomagnetic storms would be somewhere on the order of a few $100 billion. Let's say $500 billion to be generous. That's expensive, absolutely. but it's less than the expected cost of the catastrophe. Expected value is calculated as the probability times the cost. If there's a 12% chance of a Carrington-level event in the next 10 years, and the cost is $3 trillion, then the expected cost is $360 billion. That means that from an expected value perspective, spending $500 billion today to prevent the catastrophe is not a sound investment. But if we use a longer time horizon, the calculation changes. If there's a 63% chance of a Carrington-level event in the next 100 years, and the cost is $3 trillion, then the expected cost is about $1.9 trillion. That means that from an expected value perspective, spending $500 billion today to prevent the catastrophe is an excellent investment, because the expected cost of the catastrophe is nearly 4 times the cost of prevention. But this kind of calculation assumes rational decision-making on a national scale. And our actual decision-making is not rational in this way. It's short-term oriented. It's focused on quarterly earnings reports and election cycles, not on 100-year timescales. It's fragmented across thousands of different decision-making entities, all with individual incentives that don't align with the collective good. And it's subject to psychological biases that make us discount low-probability, high-impact risks. So here we are in 2026 in a situation where we've known about this threat for decades, where we know how to address it, where the cost of prevention is less than the expected cost of the catastrophe, but where we're not actually taking meaningful action. It's frustrating. It's infuriating. But it's also very human. Here's the thing. The Carrington event isn't the only threat we face. There are other solar events. There are other geomagnetic storms. There are other catastrophic scenarios that could unfold. We need to think about resilience. We need to think about robustness. We need to think about how to build civilization in a way that can withstand shocks. We need to have strategic conversations about what matters. We need to invest in resilience. We need to think long-term. We need to overcome the coordination problems that prevent us from acting in our collective interest. The next Carrington event is coming. We don't know when, but it's coming. The question is not whether it will occur. The question is how prepared we'll be when it does. And the answer to that question depends on the choices we make today. We stand at a crossroads. One path leads to a civilization that is resilient, that thinks long-term, that takes seriously the responsibility to preserve itself. The other path leads to a civilization that is fragile, that optimizes for short-term gains, that accepts the risk of catastrophe because addressing the risk is inconvenient. Which path will we choose? That is the question that will define our era. Thank you for listening to CosmHush.